Okay. Well, thank you everyone for being here today and listening to my presentation, the solution of a marketplace. I'm going to cover a lot of different topics today, from the marketplace that we've developed in the United States into agronomy and then different agricultural practices. Myself, I am a vice president of the Hemp Feed Coalition. I also founded the Nebraska Hemp Industries Association and work with another number of other nonprofit organizations in the United States to help further the growth of this commodity. I've worked for a couple different companies. Bish Enterprises, it's a family-owned business since 1976. We've been manufacturing agricultural harvesting equipment. And then in 2017, I launched a company called Hemp Harvest Works, which specifically focuses on the hemp and cannabis side of the inviting solutions to those producers. In regards to the marketplace, I'm going to share this information with you so that hopefully some of the pitfalls that we went through in the United States, you won't necessarily have to experience, but some of these you're going to experience because they are just the natural way of things. So when you look at a commodity market, there's about seven stages of a commodity market. You've got a very beginning of a trade chain, going into phase 2, new supply entering the market. Phase 3 is a cash market. Phase 4 is when oversupply occurs. Phase 5 is when vertical integration begins via mergers and acquisitions. Stage 6 is widespread extraction. And stage 7 is operating efficiencies, which are where we are with other commodities that are bought and sold on the market today. So before we talk about where we are, where we're going, let's take a look at some of the past. This is what hemp used to be and how they used to do it. Hemp was strictly a fiber plant. There typically wasn't a lot of even grain grown, and there definitely wasn't a lot of usage for CBD production in the early part of the 1900s in the United States. And this is some of the equipment that was actually used at that time to do bundling and processing of that material. So, concentrated supply chain. This started in about 2015 in the United States. We saw just a few players in the industry, and that's what's going to happen here in the very, very beginning, where there's going to be some very few people get in, and they're going to have the supply. It's not going to be a very competitive market because there's so few people involved in it. But as time goes on, you'll enter stage 2. Stage 2 is when new supply enters the marketplace. This is when you see wider spread adoption. More people starting to grow this, more buyers out there to take the material, ideally, is why you would move into stage 2. Then you start to see a cash market develop. The cash market and market-based pricing. At this particular stage, you're going to see pricing based on individual transactions that are brokered between people. There won't be immediately with prices. So this is going to be what you buy in the south of the country might be cheaper than what you'd buy in the northern part of the country or central or east or west, for example. Oversupply. This is the next stage of any type of, and this is what hopefully this country can do better than what we did in the United States. The United States went into an oversupply position in 2019, and this is what oversupply looks like. So what you're seeing behind me is the International Hemp Auction and Marketplace that went on in Franklin, Tennessee. And this is the day, I call this the day hemp died in the United States. Hemp was still doing well, but the price point just absolutely fell to the floor. There were 162 lots available in this particular auction, and 6 lots sold. That's not a good situation. Bred a lot of problems into the industry. Confidence left the industry, and the price points started to drop. Here's an example of what it looked like. So if you look at the start of 2019 from the perspective of hemp flower pricing, and then you start to look at the end of 2019, it dropped from over $3.60 down to approximately 60 cents. The market price today is actually still a little bit lower than that, and we have not yet seen a recovery. So let's move into the present and take a look at current market pricing that we see in the United States. So on CBD flower, we're seeing hemp biomass selling between 13 and 19 cents, typically around the country, per percentage point per pound. So ideally, if you add a 10% material, that could net you as much as $1.30. Realistically, you're probably going to bet on half of what you're seeing here for price points listed. Currently, I'm seeing trades coming in considerably less than that. But if you are contracting with a company, these are fair prices for future contracts. Organic biomass is coming in at about double what conventional biomass is. And then crude extract is currently trading between $60 and $100 per kilogram. Full spectrum distillate is currently trading between $135 and $200 per kilogram. Non-detectable THC broad spectrum distillate is trading $1,300, and ice right now is coming in between 2 and 500 kilograms. We have seen some price points raising in places like Colorado on the CBD isolate and distillate side, as some of the material from has started to work its way through the market. Hemp flower. Hemp flower is being sold for $75 to $275 per pound, and that is a big swing. And that swing is really just based on the part of the country that it's being grown in and sold into. Some parts of the country are more receptive to purchasing CBD flower, and some states just don't have a lot of interest in it. And then certified organic hemp flower is coming in between $100 and $305 on a per pound basis. So what do these things look like? What is hemp biomass? Here's a picture of hemp biomass. Hemp biomass is, understand hemp has multiple different commodities. You've got grain, fiber, flour. And if you're talking about flour, ideally biomass is going to be the floral material. So that's what this is a picture of. But if we were talking about grain, mass could be the grain. If we're talking about stocks, biomass could be the stock. So it's very important when you are talking to people, clarify what the definition of biomass is with both parties before making any contract. Flour, I'm sure most people understand what that looks like. This is an example of what crude extract would look like in a bottle or a jar. Distillate, isolate is typically in a powder form and a pure form. And then there's also the terpenes, which people can pull off of hemp biomass. On grain and fiber, we're seeing hemp seed grain currently trading for 50 to 55 cents on the conventional level, while on the organic level, it's trading $1.05 and $1.15 per pound. Hemp fiber raw stock is currently trading for $120 to $200 per ton. There's not really any grading standards on hemp fiber at this point. There are grading standards in terms of grain, but we haven't seen any standards in the United States relative to stock material. Hemp fiber itself is going for about $1.25 to $3 a pound. So this is going to be processed material where the fiber's been separated from the hurd product or the woody product. And then that hurd, if it's been cleaned, is currently coming in between 36 cents and 66 cents a pound, depending on volume. So a lot of these price points that we see are volume-based price points. As you buy more volume, you start to see that price point start to decline. And what do those look like? So this is what a clean fiber would look like to you. This is what a medium hurd would look like. And there's a quarter there to give you some perspective. The smaller hurd is going to range between 1/4 and 1/2 inch in size, where the medium hurd could be maybe up to 1 inch in length. Milled hurd, and this is going to be material that's been hammer milled, so it could be the medium, small, or a large hurd that's been broken down. This happens to be a 50 micron size material that we're seeing there. Oftentimes you'll see people want to use that in plastics. This is what hemp seed grain looks like, and then whole hemp seed. And a whole hemp seed is when they take the outer shell off of that seed so that they can access the higher protein material that is inside. So right now, what we're seeing in the United States, we're between stage 5 and stage 6, depending on depending on the day. But we're seeing a lot of vertical integration via mergers and acquisitions right now in the United States. Here's some examples of some press releases regarding this. In the 2021 calendar year, multiple large companies and smaller companies coming together to help deal with a lot of the bankruptcies ultimately that were happening in the end with the price point drop. So that's where the United States is, and currently to a certain degree coming out of that, but not entirely. So exchange adoption is ideally where our market in the United States is headed, and where you want to be, because when you have an adopted exchange, then you know what the market price is. You can successfully grow that crop, contract at a particular price point. Right now, there is material being sold on exchanges in the United States. Pan Exchange is currently the leader in hemp exchange material, but the volume is very, very low. Most material today in the United States is still sold from one person like myself to you. And that's how most of these contracts are still being worked out. Over the course of the next couple years, I would expect that to start changing dramatically. This is an example of exchange adoption, press release from Pan Exchange in a partnership with Bar Chart. Bar Chart is a leading commodity indicator, and their recognition of hemp helps to allow for that to continue to move forward and a commodity exchange to actually develop. It does take recognition from some of the larger exchanges, and if the larger exchanges aren't interested in recognizing that commodity, it makes it hard for you to get that market-based pricing. So now future. The future is where we start to focus on operating efficiencies, and I'm going to show you some ways that can be done and things that are being done to improve that. So where does the market go from here? Ultimately, there's been a lot of people talk about these things, so I'm not going to get off into the weeds, but textiles, human consumption, animal feed, really excited about animal feed. It's not legal to feed hemp to animals in the United States, and I don't think it's illegal here, but there's huge protein opportunities for animals that can come from feeding hemp seed, hemp cake, all sorts of varieties of hemp to an animal. Fuel, building materials, plastic alternatives, chemical cleanup, and paper, just to name a few of the products that we can start seeing happening to us. So now I'm going to transition into agronomy. So as you're looking at growing this commodity, there's a lot of things to consider. Field selection, that's going to be very, very crucial, the very groundwork. And that's going to take some testing. Where does this plant grow well? What kind of, I'm not familiar with all the different microclimates that are going on in and around Costa Rica, but those are going to affect potentially your field selection, as well as the amount of water that particular area gets, whether it's dry, wet, things of that nature. Crop rotation. Hemp is a great rotational crop. I think it's a much better rotational crop than it is as a monocrop. We don't do a lot of monocropping in the United States. You start to bring weed pressures and other insect pressures into your environment when you strictly do monocropping. So I'm a big fan of using it in the crop rotation rather than just planting field after field after field. Your input cost is also going to start up if you focus on hemp and then hemp and then hemp and then hemp. You're going to start to see those input costs start to go up. Variety selection. I know that there's been a lot of testing done on different seed varieties that may perform well here, but there's going to be more research to be done on grain and fiber as well. And that's going to be a little bit more of a challenge, probably more so on the grain side than the fiber side. But there are some limitations in terms of varietals that are going to work well here due to your consistent sunlight, darkness conditions. Seeding, what's the rate that you're going to plant? To be considered, that's going to directly affect your input cost, and it's ultimately going to affect the tonnage, the yield on the backside. Fertility, making sure to do soil testing. That's a very, very big part of this, is understanding what's in the soil today, what's going to be needed for that plant. Weed control, understanding what your plan is for that. If you're doing a grain and fiber crop, you're planting those crops a lot closer. You can use mechanical cultivation. Some of them aren't going to need cultivated at all after they've been planted. And then in some situations where you're doing maybe a CBD variety, you might use hand cultivation or small implements, even lawnmowers, things like that, depending on what your particular growing style looks like. I'm going to skip that slide. So soil properties. There's a lot of different soil out there. Again, understanding your area and what varieties grow well in particular soil types. Some varieties work better in a sandy soil versus a loam. Some work better in a loamy soil. So what works good over here may not work as well over here. And some people, of course, have fields where the soil can vary as you go through the field. That's going to give you a different result than what you might experience if you had a consistent soil condition. So when we're looking at seeding, we typically a shallow of maybe a half inch. Have seen people plant that deeper in very dry conditions. In our country, when the further north you get, you typically can get a little bit deeper into the ground and not run into a problem. If you're doing CBD, you're probably planting at a 5 to 10 pound per acre seeding rate if you're doing, for instance, agricultural CBD production. Now, if you're doing horticulture CBD production, you're probably more likely at 2,700 seeds per acre, and you're likely planting clones or you're planting seedlings, things of that nature. But for grain, we typically see 20 to 25 pounds on the input side of on a per acre basis. And what does that look like? So 25 pounds, I know Rusty talked a little bit about this the other day. On average, I like to use 28,000 seeds per pound for an average number, but ultimately, once you pick your varietal, you'll be able to identify what are the seeds per pound and then get that exact ratio worked out. But on average, we're seeing 20 to 25 pounds of seeding rate per acre for grain. We typically see that doubled on the fiber side of things. We're trying to constrain that plant and remove some of the biomass that might be growing that would ultimately lead to seed. Warm soils, it definitely grows better in warm soils above 50 and 55 degrees for proper germination. If you're down below that, you could have some germination issues. And then there's all sorts of different types of equipment that we can go into, but on grain and fiber, you're typically looking at drills and planters, where on CBD, you might be planting and you might be transplanting. So when you're making a variety selection, how do you pick your variety? Well, especially here and even in the United States, the data is really, really scarce. And when you start to look at equatorial climates, it gets there's a lot less data on that. So anybody interested in growing this crop on a grain and fiber, if that's their output, really needs to do a lot of testing, getting involved in actually doing more varietal tests in their particular area. So you can definitely try to get localized data, but I don't think that there is much on the grain and fiber side. I understand Dan's done a lot of different testing on different genetics for CBD, but definitely need more data on grain and fiber. Obviously, the more site years you have, the better, because you can start to spot trends and things of that nature. But even where we are in the United States, we're way too early to spot some of those trends. What we do in the United States is oftentimes look at what how those varieties are growing in Europe and try to make some projections based on that. Sometimes you're in the ballpark, sometimes you're really far off. And again, it's taking that risk and understanding what that risk factor looks like. But you can mitigate that by reducing the amount of crop that you grow early on. And then, trials just aren't enough information. We just need more data. So when we're looking at variety, you also want to understand what your yield is going to be. So if the plant grows really well, but it doesn't produce very much tonnage, that's not very exciting. So really understanding what it is and tying that into that. So if you're growing for grain and you've got a variety that produces excellent stalk, but doesn't produce a lot of grain tonnage, that's not ideal. That might be ideal for the fiber processor. Height. This is something that I think we have a crisis with in the United States. People get very excited about tall hemp, and I think that there should be some enthusiasm because ideally the taller it gets, the more tonnage. But we don't always see that direct correlation. And as it gets taller, it gets harder to manage. So those are things to think about. It just anything that gets bigger and bigger becomes more unwieldy the larger that it gets. So trying to grow a plant that has an acceptable amount of height that ultimately gives you the amount of tonnage that you're looking for, finding that sweet spot between them is what you want to try to achieve. Disease susceptibility, again, very, very unknown here. But in your area, what diseases might your plants get? And we'll take a look at what some of those look like and some of the things that we experience. Herbicide tolerance. If you're using herbicides near, around, or on hemp, does that particular variety work well with that particular herbicide? Or are you going to have an issue with drift if your neighbors are using different herbicides or pesticides near you? Is that going to destroy the crop that you have? Those are all things that you're going to want to be aware of that you might not think about because it might not be something you're in control of. But your neighbors may have control of that. And so having conversations with those neighbors, under what their growing practices are, even if they're not working with hemp, understanding what their growing practices are with whatever crops that they're growing is very, very important. Maturity, understanding what stage you want to be harvested at, because different plants perform differently at different stages. And if you're trying to grow for purpose-grown fiber, for instance, you may want to cut that crop much earlier than you would a grain crop. And how does that plant perform in that earlier cutting condition versus the later condition? Those are things to be aware of. And then shelling or shattering. When you get into growing for grain, this becomes a major problem. Hemp likes to shatter or come off the plant very easily when it's grain. There are some varieties out there that are less susceptible to that shelling or that shattering. And then there's some varietals that's going to happen to. And if you have high winds in a situation where it's nearing harvest and you have a variety that tends to shatter, you could have a big wind go through and absolutely end up without any type of crop left to harvest as all those seeds get taken out. And we have seen that in certain places. So this is some daylight sensitivity issues to be aware of. This particular plant, this is a plant that is 6 inches tall, and it started its reproductive cycle on June 21st. Now this is a real challenge because as it's gone into its reproductive cycle and it's only 6 inches tall, it's going to stop producing a lot of biomass, and that's the tonnage that you're looking for. Now, we have seen plants like this, and it's fairly common for plants that start to flower early to come out of it. But again, a lot of that energy gets put into that flowering process. So even if those plants come out of it, we see much reduced tonnage and output on those particular varieties. This is the thing that I'm most concerned about in Costa Rica, is going to be the early flowering on so many different genetics that are geared more towards non-equatorial climates. Here's some fertility information that might be helpful to you. Hemp responds really well to N, P, K, and S when soil nutrients are low. And I've got some uptake numbers here just to give you an idea in comparison with canola. And we did a comparison here, not only just on the plant, but with the grain on what those inputs look like. So there's some areas in which hemp is more efficient, and then there's some areas in which hemp is less efficient. A lot of times when people talk about hemp, you know, it's with a lot of enthusiasm and optimism, and I try to talk about hemp in that way as well. But hemp isn't everything. There's some parts of hemp that just use more nutrients than other plants do, and that's okay. We just have to be aware of what that looks like. So hemp isn't going to solve every single problem out there in terms of soil nutrition. And again, a lot of these things can be resolved increasing nitrogen or any of the other components with a proper rotation. Because if you don't have that proper rotation of plants adding that back into the soil, ultimately you're going to have to input that in your farm and not have that organically occurring. Here's an example of a field with hemp doesn't like too much water. It doesn't like too much water at all. That's a big problem, and you can see the low areas and where the hemp just is not performing very well as a result of the increased amount of water. So understanding what that condition is going to look like before, and again, you know, you might have a season that's unreasonably wet. We saw that in Nebraska this last year, where we got very low performance in central Nebraska, but it rained almost twice as much as it does in a normal year. So being aware of what your conditions look like can absolutely affect your yield. All these lighter spots, and I would suggest that that's about 30% of the field, may have little to no yield. So now you're reducing your total crop by potentially 30–40%. Here's some other pictures of what excess water looks like. You can see the yellowing of the plant. That's indicative of too much water. You can see the stunted growth over here on the left. And again, the yellowing leaves. And yellow doesn't always mean that there's too much water. It could be another nutritional issue, but that's definitely a sign of excess water. And again, it's just not growing or performing very well at all. This is on a slope, and there was some drought here, and this had the other problem. So there wasn't enough water, and as a result, there's just a lot of areas that are unpopulated in the field. We didn't get the appropriate germination. If you don't get water on the plant early on in its seeding, it just won't come out of the ground. Here's some of the diseases you might see. So this is a stalk that's been infected, and some different photos of what that looked like. If you're growing for fiber, obviously this is a non-ideal situation. Some botrytis, white mold, CBD flower. This is definitely not something that you'd want to see there. If you're growing for grain, you know, not an ideal situation as it's attacking the seed head. Insects. There's a lot of different insect pressures depending on where you're going to be, and again, understanding what that looks like. The grasshoppers over here on the right. The United States has had a major problem with grasshoppers in the Montana area, which is going to be north central, a little bit western United States. And in the past couple of years, we've seen just grasshoppers go and annihilate fields, take out thousands of acres, and strip basically all of the biomass off the plant. Again, it's reducing the yield that producer is going to receive. It's not typical of Montana to do that, but the last 2 years have been really, really tough on those producers up there. Okay, so now I'm going to go into some common agricultural practices in terms of how you're going to deal with this plant. So when we talk about flower, and I'm sure I'm not the first person that's mentioned trichomes, but understanding what you're harvesting is really important. While you're harvesting the plant, you're after those trichomes. So understanding how to take care of that plant and harvest it in a way that doesn't damage those is going to be somewhat key to your. If you do damage trichomes, again, what you're doing is you're reducing overall yield. And yield reduction is a profitability reduction. And so that's the reason I like to show that. So again, there's a lot of different ways you can go about putting your plants into the ground. You could do a precision film planter or an air seeder or a transplanter or even drilling. And the way that you put that plant in the ground is going to be somewhat mostly tied to how you're going to take it out of the ground. What I like to tell people is start from the end in mind and work backwards. So what is your, who are you selling this to? What is it that you're selling them? And then making sure that your agricultural practices are in alignment with that. If you're growing smokable flower and you've got somebody that wants to buy smokable flower from you, you're probably best not to use a drill. That's not going to be an ideal situation. You're much more likely to go into a transplanting situation. But if you've got somebody that's going to buy a large volume of material that's going to be shredded up and processed for extraction, you might be able to get away with using a drill or a seeder for that particular application. This is an example of what transplanting looks like. And so again, you'd see seeds or clones that have been grown in a greenhouse and then taken out of the greenhouse and put into the ground. Depending on how you're going into the ground, whether you're using mulch or non-mulch, will determine what type of transplanter you want to use. Transplanters that work with mulch typically cost a little bit more and are slower than transplanters that don't use mulch. Now, the transplanter that you might have that uses that's good for mulch could be used in a non-mulch situation, but you couldn't use a transplanter that's designed not for mulch in a mulch situation. So one can work both directions, one can only work one way. So those are things to consider when you're looking at equipment is, again, how are we going to be planting this? How are we going to be taking it out of the field, making sure all those pieces align so that you can have the success that you want. This is a larger, just a larger transplanter. And then when you go to take this out of the field, there's a lot of different ways to do it. When we started out very early in the United States, it was mainly hand cutting. And for some people that are going to be doing CBD production here very early on, that might be a method that you take where you go out there and actually cut that down, maybe with a machete, maybe with some sort of other piece of equipment that you're using by hand. I've seen people put blades on weed eaters. That's going to be based on how much staff you might have available and their willingness to do that particular job. Over the years in the United States, there's been a less and less willingness to do that particular kind of work. It makes it more difficult to recruit people. So going into mechanized harvesting has really taken over. This is an example of a straight cutter that's basically cutting the material on the bottom and taking the whole plant and putting it into a cart. This particular device here is called stripping. So it's through and actually stripping the flower off the plant, and then it's taking that into the cart. When you have bushy plants like this, typically you're going both directions, so you're harvesting each area twice. This is a whole plant harvester. Let's see. And this is just another way to take whole plants out of the field. This is a very gentle way of doing it. Something like this can cover 2 to 3 acres per hour. And if you're having issues with, you know, going out there and actually cutting it down by hand, this is a great way to solve that problem to get an implement like this. And an implement like this can work on an 80 horsepower tractor, which is a little bit more common here than maybe 150 and 200 horsepower tractor that some of those other implements that I just showed would require. Now, as we go into grain, you're going to plant that with some sort of seeder. You're typically doing 30-inch row spacing. That's pretty common in terms of grain production. Film on the left. I've got on the right, there's an air seeder. Those are just two examples of seeding technologies that you would use. But you definitely wouldn't be transplanting grain. Again, at 25 pounds per acre, that'd be a lot of planting seeds. So this is what a harvest looks like. This is a header going through a field of grain, taking off the tops of the plant. This particular field here that you're seeing is about 180 acres. And it's got multiple different densities. This particular producer planted the crop at 3 different densities to help determine what was going to grow best in that particular area. So this picture here is from the cab of the combine. This is a much more dense area of the field than what you just saw. And again, some of that, this was the same variety grown, planted at different densities, and so the yield that happened in different areas of the field was quite dramatically different depending on what that density looked like. This is another example, just another type of header that's harvesting grain. So this is a draper style header going through a field and taking the tops off the plants. You can see that with the drapers, the biggest downside to the draper is if you have really tall hemp, that reel tends to get in the way. If you're only cutting off 1 feet, 2 feet of the plant, maybe 3 feet, that's not going to be as much of a problem. But if you're trying to cut 4 and 5 feet of plant material down, that reel is directly in the way of helping you make that happen. So on grain harvest management, things to be aware of, understanding again when to harvest that crop. You're probably at, depending on the varietal, between 125, maybe 140 days of growth cycle, where on fiber you're going to be down between 70 and 90 days of growth. You're typically going to want to get this material out of the field as close to 20% moisture as possible. And the main reason, again, is because of the shattering. Harvesting wet material isn't always ideal with machines, but if you get down to a 10% moisture level, you're likely to lose a high percentage of your crop out in the field as those seeds just pop off during that harvest period. And then once you get it out of the field, making sure to dry that down below 10%, that's going to be the moisture level that you're going to want to keep it at to retain that seed quality. Here's an example of a combine, and I'm going to show you some of the challenges that we've had with combines. Here's some combine settings. I'm not going to read those to you. I can always send those to you if you want. But hemp likes to wrap up on stuff. So when you're using equipment, being aware of that is really, really important. A lot of times you have to guard or shield different areas. And here's where you can see a lot of buildup of stock material on the axle of this combine. Here's an example of a photograph where this is actually where the telescoping power shaft connects to the header, and the hemp is wrapped up around there and ejected the power shaft off of the header. And so making sure that those things are guarded are really, really key. Here's where it's building up in the combine again. You can just see all this material. And ultimately it'll start to clog. If it's in an area where it's spinning, you're going to start building up heat, and then you could get into a fire. And so you definitely want to have fire prevention methods on your combine if you're doing some sort of grain or fiber harvesting. But the nice thing about hemp is that hemp smokes long before it fires. So you've got time usually to stop it before you're going to have a problem. And I recommend making sure that you have a lot of knives, a lot of good quality sharp knives to be able to cut things out. You'll usually stop that fire again without having to use any type of fire suppression. Whereas if you're harvesting grain crops that are high in oil like sunflowers, oftentimes by the time it's smoking, you need to run away because you're actually on fire. Hemp is a little bit different. It will start on fire. Well, hemp is naturally fire suppressant or fire resistant. So it's going to build up a lot of heat before it actually flames. Now, when you go into some common practices about fiber, that's typically direct drilled. You might do air seeding, but we typically see that done in 7.5 to 9-inch row spacing, again, at a much higher density than grain production, 40, 50 pounds per acre, depending on that varietal. And then there's definitely a multitude of ways of cutting this crop down. This is an example of a single tier sickle mower that can go through and lay this over. That's a French variety there. This variety happened to grow about 7.5 feet tall, and this way of cutting it happened to work very, very well. If it was taller than this, we may want to introduce a little bit more sickle in there and cut its length down, like this particular piece of equipment. What this particular piece of equipment is doing is it's cutting it into different fraction sizes. Hemp's just hard to handle when you go to bale it. If you've got 9-foot, 10-foot stalks, balers typically just don't like that. So if you can cut that length down, it makes it a lot easier to work with. The other option is to move into a different type of baler, like a forage harvester baler. But those pieces of equipment often run $250,000 to $300,000. So you have to get quite a substantially larger and more expensive piece of equipment to handle those larger, longer stalks. And then the next stage of fiber is going to be decortication. And decortication is separating out the stalk into its hurd and fiber components. And those are held together by lignins. And so you have to have a piece of equipment that's ultimately going to break that down. This particular piece of equipment is called a roller breaker decorticator. So it's got 6 sets of rollers, and the material actually passes through those rollers, which is breaking apart that stalk and fiber as, the hurd and the fiber as it's impacting it over and over and over and over. But what it's not doing is it's not destroying the length of that particular fiber. Let's see. I think we froze. I'm going to show you what this looks like going in here. So the way that this starts is you take a bale, you insert it into there, and then we start to unwind that bale. If you're using square bales, you'll have to use a little bit different piece of equipment than a round bale breaker. Then it passes through the main decorticator, which is doing its initial separation before going into second stage separation. There's a lot of different phases in terms of separating material, and I apologize, this video is stopping. But after it passes through the decorticator, what this machine does is it's got a shaker table, and it's shaking out some of the hurd from the fiber that's just ran through the piece of equipment. Each one of those fractions is going to go into a different path. So what you see here is the hurd that's dropping off into the bottom, and the fiber that's being carried onto a conveyor to the left. That hurd material can then be resized, and also you'll need to get some more of that fiber cleaned out of it before, let's see, we're going to stop again. This is an example of a piece of sizing equipment so that you can end up with a medium, a small, a large style hurd. Now, regardless of that, you may want to take that and break that down even further. And so this is what the hammer mill portion looks like. And that will get you into that smaller powder material that I showed you a video on, not necessarily at 50 micron, depending on what your hammer mill does. The fiber would go through a fiber cleaner, and that'll help get some more of that hurd out. And again, that hurd will be conveyed and then go through and be sorted with the rest of the process. And then what you're left over with is going to be ultimately a longer fiber, a shorter fiber, and then several different sizes of hurd that you can then decide what you're going to do with, whether you're going to break it down into smaller pieces or you're going to sell that to your customer in that particular way. This system has a dust collection system on it, and that's going to be absolutely necessary because it is a very dusty job to break all of that material up. But what's nice about the vacuum filtration system is that's gathering a commodity as well, which is going to be that micronized hurd, that very small powder that's going to be captured in that system. So ultimately, you end up with very, very little waste going through with this particular piece of equipment. So now I'm going to show you why it's going to be important for people to go out and grow very small plots of land with several different genetics to do testing in their area. These are some tests that we did around the country. And I'm just going to do some comparisons to show you how some material grew in one area versus another to highlight the need for that. So that video there is a seed plot or a plot seeder that we used to do some of our testing this last year. And this is an example of what the plots look like that we set up. So this was a variety called A2, and this is in Plattsmouth, Nebraska. So that's going to be in the center part of the United States, almost exactly center in the United States. And then when we moved that same varietal, when we moved it into North Texas, performed very, very poorly. As you can see here, it's a lot shorter than what we saw at further north. And a lot of that had to do with the daylight conditions. Here's a variety called Carmagnola. This comes out of Italy. So this again is Plattsmouth, very lush. We go into North Texas and we've got a lot of weed issues. And again, based on the size of that sign, which is an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper, the plants just did not perform very well. Futura 75, French variety, Plattsmouth, very, very consistent. Didn't get over a foot tall in North Texas. The Fibrour 79, this is one of my favorite varieties that I've ever grown. Again, did very well in Plattsmouth. And then North Texas just did not perform at all. Felina 32. Nope. Sorry. Again, you can't even see it. Just didn't get out of the ground. Didn't perform. The Yuma variety. Yuma is a Chinese variety. And this one performed a little bit better. As we go into Texas, you can actually tell that it just wasn't as big of a plant as what we saw. Now, again, timing, there's going to be a lot of things that'll affect this, but that varietal looks like it has some level of promise into Texas if we were to do more studies and work on maybe when we should plant that and some of the other things behind that. X59, this is a variety out of Canada, great grain producer in Canada. There's the little dead plant. That's the one little plant that you can see there. Again, just very, very low performance. But then here's an MS77 variety. This came out of Australia. And when we went into Texas, again, we saw some potential promise there. Not as tall as what we wanted to see. But again, we could look at, well, maybe we need to plant that earlier this year. Maybe there's some fertilizers that need to be added to this. But at least between the Yuma and the MS77, we were able to identify a couple viable contenders that we could start doing more studying on. And that's ultimately what you're going to be looking for here in Costa Rica. What are the potential viable plants? And then here's an example of some very large stocks. So sometimes, and in Plattsmouth, where we saw some of our better yields, we ended up with some challenges that you don't want. Over here on the left, you can see a stalk that is 3 inches in diameter, and that's really hard to cut. A sickle mower, for instance, can only cut a plant that's 2 1/4 inches thick. So you couldn't even use the same implements that we use to cut down everything else in this particular field. So that could be controlled by cutting the plant down earlier. But if you were growing for grain variety, you're going to be growing much longer periods. So that's going to be a problem. But on the fiber side of things, you could mitigate that stalk size by getting to the field in less days. So rather than getting in there at 90 days, this crop may need to be harvested at 70 days so that it can be efficiently harvested. The other challenge we had was after we did pull a plant like this out of the field, we couldn't actually decorticate it. So while there definitely appeared to be a lot of tonnage in the field in terms of yield, it wasn't usable tonnage. We even tried to use sledgehammers just to break the stalk apart, and some of these stalks were tougher than the sledgehammer, quite honestly, and we just didn't make much progress at all. This is an example of how we cut that down, which I definitely would not advise. We were doing very, very small plots for research, but ultimately we ended up having to use a chainsaw to get that material out and stacked up for our testing process. So if you want to find out more about what we do, feel free to check out our website, our Bish Enterprise website at www.bishenterprise.com. You can go to Hemp Harvest Works at hempharvestworks.com. There's contact us forms if you're trying to get a hold of me. We'll get back in touch with you as quickly as we can. And thank you for being here today. And I don't know if I have time for questions or if I have time for questions.